welcome to another episode of Piecing It Together, the podcast where we take a look at a new movie and try to figure out what movies inspired it. And today on the show, we're actually doing one of our special Missing Pieces episodes. This is a side series where we kind of take the format and mess with it a little bit. We take a movie, I like to say roughly from the year 2000 through 2018 when I started the podcast, and take a look at movies that inspired the movie, and then take a look at some movies that the movie itself inspired. Because, you know, it's been years since the movie's come out, and it's very possible that it's had some influence on some films that have come since. And today, we are doing a movie that is back in theaters for its 20th anniversary celebration. It's Edgar Wright's Shaun of the Dead. This is such a fun movie, and actually, today that this is going up, I'm in the movie theaters watching this in Dolby Cinema. I'm so excited to watch it again, and I'm very excited to talk about it with my guest, Michael Ornelas from the Fine Dining podcast. We have a great conversation, lots of puzzle pieces to get into, both movies that inspired Shaun of the Dead and movies that Shaun of the Dead inspired. So we will get into that here in a second. Before we get to it, I do want to remind you, as always, to make sure you're subscribed to Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on social media at PiecingPod. And don't forget to join our Facebook group, Popcorn and Puzzle Pieces, where we continue the conversation about all the movies we talk about here on the show. And with that said, grab a pint and let's talk about Shaun of the Dead. All right, we are going to talk about Shaun of the Dead today, which should be a really fun one to get into. And joining me, we've got Michael Ornelas. Michael, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you, David?
I am good. I am excited for this whole 20th anniversary re-release in the theaters. I saw it back when it came out. I actually saw it at the 10th anniversary re-release in the theaters, and here we are now on the 20th. It's pretty crazy that this movie has been around for so long. Before we get into the movie, though, I do want you to introduce yourself to my listeners. Tell them about you and your podcast and everything you do.
So I do a podcast called Fine Dining, the search for the most mediocre restaurant in America. Mm-hmm. It's a comedy podcast disguised as a food podcast, but basically I spend 2 weeks talking about different chain restaurants each episode. The first week is talking about like the history and picking out some fun Yelp reviews. Second week is I actually go there with my guest and we review it and talk all about it. Right now, Cracker Barrel's the most mediocre, but
Sure.
Yeah, it feels about right. But really, I love chain restaurants, and this is an excuse to go to all of them if I can manage.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a fun concept for a show. Have you ever done any like Vegas-based, I'm in Las Vegas, anything out here?
So actually, we're 2 days away from September, and I have, if I can plug it for a second, I have a giant tournament, a burger tournament called Septemburger.
Ooh,
and
nice.
8 burgers enter, 1 burger leaves. And the winner, I mean, I'm not going to actually ship it to the corporation, but you can see there I have a Septemburger championship belt.
Lovely.
And I drove to Vegas for one of the 8 restaurants. I went to the White Castle on the Strip.
Okay.
And
right.
I won't spoil it for any listeners that want to play along, but if anyone wants to go to my Linktree, that's linktree.com/fine dining podcast. I have like March Madness style brackets, and you can fill them out to see who you think is going to advance in each round of Septemburger. And if you're correct, you can win $500.
Right on. Yeah, that's fun. That is a tasty tournament. Absolutely.
It's a lot of calories.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
getting back to Shaun of the Dead, this is one that you picked, and I was, funny enough, like planning on doing it because of the whole 20th anniversary. So when you suggested it, I was like, yeah, you know what? Let's do this. Was this a movie that you've been like, that you've loved since it came out?
This is a movie I've loved since about maybe 2 or 3 years after it came out.
Okay.
I feel like I kind of had like a cinematic awakening when I was like 17, which would have been like, 2005, 2006. And Shaun of the Dead was kind of one of the movies that my friend Gabe, who kind of like opened the floodgates of like all these like good movies, because I was just watching like dumb comedies, which I still love dumb comedies,
Sure.
but that was all I wanted in my early teenage years.
Yeah.
And, Shaun of the Dead, while still very funny, definitely a step above in terms of how its humor is presented. And I instantly fell in love with the style and the visual pacing and the editing and all that. So yeah, I've loved this movie for a long time.
Yeah, I think one thing about Edgar Wright as a filmmaker is that he is such a student of like every movie that's come before, that like he really kind of brings everything together into what he does, whether it's writing, visuals, just all of it. And so I think that this will be a fun episode to talk about like inspirations and then what it inspired, because there's just so much that we could kind of go for. So with that said, let's start jumping into it. This being a missing pieces episode, we will start with some movies that inspired Shaun of the Dead, and then we'll transition over to some movies that it inspired, since like we said, this is 20 years ago, so there's a lot that's come since that I think we can bring up. But starting off with things that may have inspired Shaun of the Dead, what do you have for your first piece?
So my first one, I mean, look, obviously we're going to be talking a lot of zombie movies here today.
Sure.
I think what I consider the most underrated of the Romero movies is Day of the Dead, not Dawn of the Dead specifically. I love that it does have, I guess, a few more comedic beats or comedic visuals than we're used to from like Dawn of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead. So I picked Day of the Dead. I'm unapologetically a huge fan of that movie.
Absolutely. And I feel like, we might as well, I'll just throw Dawn of the Dead on top of that. Might as well throw Night of the Living Dead on top of that. I mean, it's little bits and pieces of the entire Romero series are, spoken for in this film. And obviously it's the namesake here. I mean, we are making a comedy based off of those movies, essentially. And yeah, Day of the Dead is a great one. I mean, I haven't seen it in many years, but all three of those movies, and I even really like Land of the Dead as well. They really do it all. They really get everything in there. And Shaun of the Dead, I think Dawn of the Dead, aside from the name, obviously rhyming, but I feel like there's the most aspects of that in there, from being trapped in that location and everything, and a bar being kind of mall-like in a way, it's a business or whatever. But, you get the relationship stuff there as well. And so there's a lot of Day of the Dead in there too. But yeah, let's just throw it all in the pot. And then we'll move on from Romero. But what do you have for your next piece?
Evil Dead 2.
Sure.
You can't not mention Evil Dead 2. Probably one of the earlier big departures into adding comedy to a horror film setup. Like that movie just has so many great comedic beats. The chainsaw hand and all that just going out of control. I feel like there's a lot of slapstick in Evil Dead 2, and I feel like that legacy lives on in Shaun of the Dead for sure.
Absolutely. It is still the best horror comedy of all time, as far as I'm concerned, even though Shaun of the Dead is up there. And Edgar Wright is on record as that being like, if not his favorite movie, it's like one of his all-time favorite movies, and you could totally see why. And it was definitely on my list too. I mean, anyone who listens to this podcast knows I bring up the Evil Dead movies way too much, so I'm glad you did it. So yes, thank you for bringing that one in here. I will go with another movie with dead in the title. I'm going with Return of the Living Dead, the punk rock zombie movie, which started off as a book that was a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, a direct sequel, and then turned into this other like side series that got its own sequels and everything. But just insane, gross out practical effects, a punk rock soundtrack, which Shaun of the Dead has a great soundtrack as well. And just, again, like with Evil Dead, like bringing in the comedic elements into the zombie and horror and all of those things as well. So definitely have to include Return of the Living Dead on the list here.
I am unfamiliar with that one.
It's so much fun.
It's like I feel like I got to a point where I was really into zombies for a while, and then I like lost the plot as far as which ones were Romero movies of the Dead versus other ones that were just stealing the of the Dead. And obviously
Yeah.
Shaun of the Dead was going for like, we are an homage, but a lot of the others, like if you just tell someone like Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Return of the Living, like they would assume they're all the same guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And since his passing, I mean, there's other direct-to-video ones, and like,
Yeah.
there's like you could probably find an entire tree of the directions that the series and fake parts of the series have spawned off from. But that is one of the best ones that's not part of the main continuum. So
Okay.
yeah, definitely check it out. What do you got next?
Okay, so I didn't want to make everything horror, and so
Mhm.
I'm looking for other connections. And I could have done one of two movies to fit this bill, but big noteworthy sequences set to Queen music, I went with Highlander.
Oh, very nice, very nice.
And,
Highlander's on my rewatch list. I haven't seen any of those movies since high school, and I know they're making a remake next year, so I've
okay.
got to rewatch those movies sometime
I've
soon.
only seen the first one, but I mean, you know, you've got Queen and a movie where like beheading is a big component. I feel like that
Sure.
fits.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. And yeah, I mean, Edgar Wright, like we were talking about, his cinematic tastes are just wide reaching, and everything from the action, the horror, the comedy, the classics, just everything in there. So getting some Highlander in there, absolutely. I am gonna go. I'll stick with horror, but horror comedy, and go to a spoof. I'm going with Scary Movie. The Wayans brothers.
Okay.
They had just spoofed the Scream series just a few years before Shaun of the Dead came out. So I feel like even like on a business end of this, like the fact that a horror comedy that takes well-known tropes of the specific genre and just plays with them in a way that is winking at the audience and the characters, they know they're in this kind of movie. Shaun of the Dead isn't specifically a spoof, but it certainly does play with some of the same kind of language of the characters being aware of what's going on, and they kind of have to, use their understanding of these kinds of movies to be able to survive.
Yeah, I feel like it definitely, you mentioned the business side. It definitely showed a viability that a movie that is that tongue in cheek about horror can work on a grand scale.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's get one more puzzle piece of inspired Shaun of the Dead. What do you got?
I had those three, but I could just go Flash Gordon and go off the last one. I'll say Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, British comedy, fast pace, excessive violence. I feel like there's no way Edgar Wright hadn't seen that movie and maybe thought of it for even a second in
Absolutely.
his
Well,
creation.
there's so much like quick pacing and fast cutting and all that kind of stuff that is a big part of everything really that Edgar Wright does, and we'll talk about it as we're getting into the things that this movie inspired. But yeah, a lot of that kind of point of view and that kind of editing style and all that stuff. And so I think Lock, Stock is a great one to include here. So absolutely. I've got my last one. In general, Monty Python, that British humor, you can go to any of their films, but their entire kind of sensibility as well. I think, to Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg's previous work with Spaced and just kind of everything they do, I'm sure that Monty Python is like kind of their personal biggest influence, most likely.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And that would go back to like, yeah, when he's literally growing up, what's planting that seed. So I like
Yeah.
that pick.
Absolutely. Well, let's move forward. This, of course, coming out in 2004. We have we've got horror comedies, we've got very British comedies, like all the kind of stuff that you associate with this movie. You got drunks kind of making their way through some kind of adventure.
Right.
There's a lot of directions to go. I feel like the obvious place to start, though, and so I'll go first for this portion, is the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy, Edgar Wright's other collaborations with Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. Hot Fuzz, I think, is the best of the bunch, but The World's End is really good, too. And those three movies combined as this kind of unofficial trilogy, I think it's definitely the place to start this, and they're so much fun. Are you a big fan of the other two?
I have only seen. I always mess up the name. At World's End.
The World's End.
The
there
World's End?
was a Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. I always mix them up too.
Yeah. I only saw The World's End once, and it wasn't that memorable to me. Hot Fuzz was one that I actively was like, I thought was overrated by everyone the first time I saw it, and then I watched it again like probably 5 years ago and really had an appreciation and looked in the mirror and was like, "You've been wrong all these years. Forgive yourself."
Yeah,
and so I did. Yeah, Hot Fuzz is great.
It's important to be able to admit that. I've done that with lots of movies before. So yeah, absolutely, it's so damn good. But yeah, let's go to another one. What do you got?
Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Buddies, just a couple of buddies in the horror comedy realm. Even like one a little bit more rotund and one a little bit more wiry. I feel like even the body makeup is there to just feel like a Shaun of the Dead, Nick Frost, Simon Pegg duo. And I think at its core, the whole reason that Shaun of the Dead works for me is that friendship never takes a back seat to anything else. Like, you can say this is a zombie movie, but it, much like how Everything Everywhere All at Once is like, it's a movie about a family and it's got all these distractions. But I think Shaun of the Dead is very much just a movie about friendship with a lot of other things going on.
Absolutely. And I think that could be said for that entire trilogy, actually. I think that's something that Edgar Wright, Simon Pegg, and Nick Frost, they constantly want to come back to. Like, at its core, it has to be about that friendship. And then everything else are just different genre trappings, different kinds of action, horror, sci-fi, comedy, whatever it is. But yeah, that friendship has to be central. So definitely. And I feel like I need to give that movie another chance, the Tucker and Dale. Obviously, a lot of these movies are movies meant to be watched late at night with friends, probably with drinks. And I think I was a little too under the influence when I watched it back in college. So yeah, I definitely owe that one another watch sometime. I am going to go with, speaking of things British, I'm going to go with Attack the Block from 2011.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like a kind of group of young British people who get trapped in some kind of genre, adventure, these young British gang members who have to survive an alien invasion, and it just turns completely insane. I think also you could kind of point to John Boyega as a star in a similar way as Simon Pegg kind of. John Boyega moved on to the Star Wars movies from there, whereas Simon Pegg moved on to Star Trek and Mission Impossible.
And the Star Wars. Was he not in Star Wars? I think he voiced someone, did he not?
Yeah, he voiced one of the characters, absolutely. So,
I think he was the guy that in episode 7 was like trying to buy BB-8 for you half portion. Was that not Simon Pegg?
I think you're right. I think
that is.
Yeah, so
if I'm wrong, just cut it off.
Simon Pegg would absolutely throw his weight around to get in a Star Wars movie.
Yeah.
So it must be right. But yeah, no, I think their careers definitely have like a fairly similar trajectory there. And really John Boyega should be a bigger star by this point, but that's another conversation. But yeah, Attack the Block, hilarious and great and awesome action too.
For sure.
What do you got next?
A movie that when it came out kind of took my world by storm. I love this next movie, Zombieland, and I don't think Zombieland happens at all without Shaun of the Dead. I feel like it took the baton from them and ran it in a just completely new and fresh direction, from editing style to just all of it. Honestly, like I loved Zombieland so much. So
yeah. Absolutely. Zombieland was also one that I was thinking about too. I mean, I think like you said, it doesn't happen without Shaun of the Dead. And it's almost in a way, it's like the very, very, very Americanized version of Shaun of the Dead.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like stylistically, it is to Shaun of the Dead what the U.S. office is to the British office.
Yes, absolutely. So great pick there. I don't usually do this, but I'm going to go with a movie that I've never seen. It's just one that's always been, I've always remembered the poster, and I have always wanted to check this movie out. It's a 2006 horror comedy called Fido. And by now, everybody's seen Shaun of the Dead. So we can spoil at the ending with zombie Nick Frost being chained up in the den. and kind of like a pet. And Fido kind of almost jumps off from that point because it's about a future where zombified people become pets. Obviously, you could tell by the name Fido of the movie. And it sounds like a really fun movie, but like I said, I've never seen it. Have you ever seen Fido?
I've never seen Fido. I remember kind of on the tail end of Blockbuster being a thing, going through the aisles, and I'd see the case for Fido, and I'd pick it up, but it never grabbed me enough to actually go rent it and watch it.
Yeah, one of these days maybe, but yeah, it just feels like it takes that ending and kind of runs with it. So figured I'd throw that one on the list. What do you have next?
Sounds like a fun premise. So next one, I think I mentioned the friendship element, but even like with the beat of, finding out his mom's been bitten, there is a lot of heart in Shaun of the Dead. And I think infusing high familial emotional stakes with zombies, I'm going to say Train to Busan. Especially because a lot of Korean films are inspired by American or British or, popular Hollywood-esque movies. So
absolutely.
I'm not convinced that it's a direct influence, but I could see a case.
Well, yeah, and also, the zombie thing in pop culture, it got so big for a while that it kind of turned on itself. But I think Shaun of the Dead is one of the few that were kind of keeping it alive, even though it is a comedy. And so any continued influence in pop culture as far as zombie movies are concerned, I think Shaun of the Dead, it's one of the best ones of the last 20 years, even if it's a comedy. So I think its influence could be even on the more serious zombie movies.
Sure.
I will go with Warm Bodies from 2013, a zombie comedy talking about the heart. It's more of a rom-com, basically, with Nicholas Hoult and Teresa Palmer. And, the idea of kind of melding all of these genres together in a way that probably shouldn't work, but then it really just does. I think Warm Bodies does a great job of kind of getting all those genres together and making something that really just feels like it fits, even though it's such a strange idea in the first place.
Yeah, the melding of genres of Warm Bodies honestly weirded me out when I saw it in theaters. I want to say like opening weekend. It was I knew nothing about it beforehand. It wasn't like, oh, I'm waiting for this movie or anything. It was just like, I want to go see a movie this weekend. This premise sounds interesting. And I just felt odd watching it, seeing those genres mixed, but I didn't dislike it. It was just out of not even my comfort zone, but like the comfort zone that we're conditioned to see in movie genres. It was a very, it defied the expected tropes, I guess.
Absolutely. And that, again, like just to kind of bring it back to Edgar Wright himself, I mean, I think that's something that he's trying to do with all of his movies, continuing forward. Scott Pilgrim, even something like Last Night in Soho, which I didn't necessarily love, but definitely, plays with the genres in ways that you just wouldn't expect and kind of mixes things together. That's Baby Driver, too. That's just something that he's always trying to do, I feel like.
Yeah, it's as a director who has like a very unique voice, I think that's important. Like, obviously it's important, but like, I've never seen a paint by numbers Edgar Wright movie. And I think that speaks volumes to getting me excited to see, any new release that he does.
Absolutely. 100%.
Like, I almost don't care about like premise or elevator pitch or whatever. Just tell me Edgar Wright directed a movie and you have my attention.
Yeah, we're in for sure, 100%. So obviously we could talk for an hour on things that this movie inspired, but do you have any others that you wanted to mention before we wrap it up?
I have one more. I think I'm going to go so far as to call it my favorite horror comedy.
Ooh.
Cabin in the Woods.
Okay.
I adore everything about Cabin in the Woods, and I feel like that it feels like everything influenced that movie. It literally took little pieces of all these beloved tropes, franchises, monsters, stuff like that, put them into one spot. And there's definitely the thumbprint of Shaun of the Dead in there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And certainly the the melding of everything that's come before into one movie. Cabin in the Woods is 100% that movie. So I think that is definitely a great one to wrap it up with. So any closing thoughts, anything about Shaun of the Dead we didn't get to that you want to mention before we wrap this thing up?
I will say that if a zombie apocalypse ever happens for real, I am now convinced that a cricket bat would not be the worst thing to have on hand.
that would be a very good thing. I like the records personally. I work in a vinyl record store, so that definitely hits home for me. But the cricket bat would be very, very helpful as well.
Yeah. So if there's one life lesson to take from Shaun of the Dead,
yeah,
keep your friends close. And your cricket bat closer.
Speaking of which, God, now I can't. I'm drawing a blank on the name. But there's a video game, a zombie video game, where you can like find items to use as weapons. And
is it Left 4 Dead?
Maybe it is Left 4 Dead. Yeah, and literally anything could be a weapon. And I'm sure there's probably vinyl records, and I'm sure there's probably a cricket bat, just as a odd to Shaun of the Dead. So its influences all over the place. I was trying to think, just as my kind of closing thought here. Is this the beginning of the let's fast forward through the plan and then show the plan kind of going to shit? Maybe it happened before in like Ocean's 11 or something. I don't know, but
no, I don't. You might be right. I mean, Ocean's 11 definitely had like the elaborate plan bit, but I feel like really hitting that comedic side of it.
Yeah,
I think Shaun of the Dead is the first place I've seen it.
I think so too. So, throw that in there either as an influence on this or something that it influenced, but one way or the other, it belongs in the conversation, I think.
Sure.
So, yeah, that's a good place to wrap up Shaun of the Dead. Michael, I always end these asking my guests, is there a movie you watched recently that you want to recommend to our listeners?
Yes. My all-time favorite movie is Alien. I just saw Alien Romulus, and it's not a perfect movie, but I feel like it's about as good of an alien movie as I can expect, given Hollywood's current sensibilities towards fan service.
Sure.
Which, like, I'm not into all the fan service that they did. I wish it was just like, hey, it's very much its own thing. But I do feel like they did what they could to make it its own thing. And have you seen Alien Romulus?
Absolutely. We actually just did a live episode at the movie theater on it last week. And yeah, it's funny because in the moment, the fan service stuff didn't bother me. And we recorded the episode like right there in the movie theater afterwards. And we talked about it. We were like, yeah, that's kind of, we didn't love that part, but we liked everything else about it. And then we leave the theater and get on social media. And it's like, it's just a fan service fest from beginning to end. And I'm like, come on, guys. Like,
yeah, I mean, like, so my big issue that I don't love. I didn't love it in oh God, what was the Star Wars movie that was between 4 and 5? Or
Rogue
3 and
One.
4? Rogue One.
Yeah.
I just don't love a CGI face.
Yeah.
Like the Uncanny Valley we have not traversed through it yet.
Yeah.
So maybe don't have a character that hinges so much on that presentation. It's just that the effects didn't match. Conceptually, I don't mind the idea of I guess they called him Rook in this one, but of Ash coming back and being a
sure.
Yeah, just we don't need to do quotes. We don't need to do quotes from past movies in the franchise.
Yeah. I'm with you. I mean, it's definitely a good movie. I had a really good time with it. None of that stuff bothers me that much, but really, let's keep it to a minimum.
Yeah. But it scratched the itch of like, a new Alien movie that I like, because Alien Covenant did not. I'm not a fan.
Yeah, well, I'm in the minority on that one. I love it, but that's,
really?
That's another conversation first.
I'm in the minority on Prometheus. I love Prometheus, so
I love Prometheus too. I think there's no bad Alien movies. That's my quote. But yeah. So, but tell people again where they can find you and your podcast and everything else you're up to.
I'm at Fine Dining Podcast on Instagram and TikTok. If you want to see clips from the show, I do a video show, so you can check me out on YouTube. You can check me out wherever you get your podcasts. But yeah, I start Septemberger on September 4th, and then I hit In-N-Out, White Castle, and Shake Shack in the 3 weeks after that, before wrapping it all up at the end of the month to declare a winner. Yeah. So check it out. It's a fun show. It's silly. It's goofy. And I talk about food.
Right on. If you do another one here in Vegas, maybe we'll go get a burger sometime. That would be fun.
Yeah, for sure.
On March 27th, 2024, Elon Musk was deposed in a libel lawsuit filed by Ben Brody. The deposition is a new Hug House podcast reenactment of the entire deposition, word by word, in full, taken very seriously.
May I finish?
Sure.
Do you feel you need to yell again?
I might.
The deposition drops on the 4th of July, 2024, with 4 weekly episodes. Subscribe on your podcatcher of choice or find us at hughouse.productions today.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that conversation about Shaun of the Dead. Thank you so much to Michael Ornelas for joining me on that one. It's funny, I was thinking about doing an episode because of this 20th anniversary, and all of a sudden I get an email, hey, do you want to do an episode on Shaun of the Dead? Funny how things work out sometimes. Hey, maybe you listening right now would like to join me for an episode sometime. Get in touch. Maybe we'll get you on the show. Also, if you have any puzzle pieces for this movie or any other movies we've covered recently on Piecing It Together, get in touch. I'll read those on the next trailer episode. I love hearing from people who listen. And I just want to thank you all so much for being out there and listening. If you're enjoying Piecing It Together, make sure you are subscribed wherever it is that you're listening. Also, maybe drop us a little 5-star rating and review, whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, Spotify. You could do it on Pocket Casts now. All those ratings and reviews, they help make sure more people check out the show, and that is very much appreciated. You could also follow us on social media at Piecing Pod. Join our Facebook group, Popcorn and Puzzle Pieces. And don't forget, we do have a Patreon, the Produced by David Rosen Patreon, where I post bonus and advanced content from Piecing It Together, from Awesome Movie Year, and from my music career. Lots of great stuff over there at patreon.com/bydavidrosen. I appreciate you guys all being out there listening, but, you know, I of course appreciate it too if you want to sign up for the Patreon and help support the show in that way. So check that out. And with that said, let's close this out with a piece of music like we always do. And I was thinking, you know, the horror comedy element here. I'm going to go with a piece from a film score I did years ago. I think I've played this on the show before. I'm almost certain I have. But this is from a short horror comedy film that I scored years ago called CROAK, about killer human-sized frogs. And I think it's a good fit for something like Shaun of the Dead. So this is a piece of the score from CROAK, and we'll be back with more Piecing It Together real soon.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.